Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan Stabina. I'm VP Technologies from Sherritt. And as my mug says, I'm calling in from the Sherritt office in beautiful downtown Toronto. Cheryl Hart works with us. She runs her own shop, On Task Strategies, and she's calling in from Richmond Hill. And Jan Smits calling in from beautiful downtown Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, the site of our technologies division, as well as where our nickel refinery is. So Lisa, I really wish we had 3 hours for you. This hour is just going to fly by. So the topic here is deepen your carbon credit knowledge. And the way it works is I'll be asking Lisa some questions, discuss amongst yourselves in the chat room. If you have a specific question, please ask it in the Q&A. There's a separate Q&A button. If Cheryl sees anything exciting trending in the chat room or Jan, they'll break in and say, hey, what do you think about this, Lisa? So in general, I'm not an expert on carbon credits, so I am hoping to learn a lot from this session, but luckily Lisa is. We'll talk about different types of carbon credits, some of the acronyms, what's insetting, what's offsetting, the latest developments in carbon credit legislation, and it's a chance for us to all learn about a very exciting topic. So Lisa DeMarco, I'll get you to introduce yourself, but I'll just give a few notes that I have here. So Lisa is a senior partner and CEO of Resilient LLP. She's a leading figure in sustainability and carbon finance industry. She's highly recognized expert in climate and energy law, and a few people have been messaging us and said they've heard you speak on panels, and they're quite happy that you're joining us today. Extensive background advising leading financial and energy companies, and she's recognized as a global elite thought leader in climate change and who's legal. So, Lisa, I know your background's in legal, but I'm curious to see the overlap with regulation, with finance, society, and so forth. As you could see, there's a poll being launched right away. We just want to see your opinion, and we'll give the feedback to Lisa on what you're thinking. So please answer the poll question before we get started. So Lisa, do you want to just introduce yourself and let them know what you want them to know about you?
Well, thanks very much, Nathan, and thanks, Jan and Cheryl as well for having me. I think you've covered most of it. If I had to summarize who I am and what I do, I would say 2 words, and they are carbon nerd. We really get deep on all aspects of the use of an emission reduction or removal as a form of an asset class to facilitate meeting the Paris goals in general and sustainability writ large. And that can be part of ESG, and that can be part of a prudent finance strategy as well. So that's the summary. I would add that Resilient is Canada's only climate change specialized boutique law firm, and we do act in association with Fasken and other firms from time to time globally. So a tiny firm with a very, very large back office. So that's how we operate.
Cheryl, Jan, do you have the answers to the poll? Just curious what people are thinking.
I see that the poll ended with only one person having had the opportunity to respond. So maybe we should relaunch.
No, I saw more than that.
So what do you believe is the primary function of a carbon credit? So it'll be interesting to see how everybody answers now, and then after they hear some information from Lisa on how everybody feels at the end of the session.
Okay.
Oh.
It's trending in this. Yeah.
Exchange, incentive. All right, let's end the poll. Let's see. Everybody put it in?
So about a 60% incentive for emitting less carbon.
Okay.
And a third exchange currency between carbon emitters. Okay, so Lisa, a couple of questions for you. So one, what inspired you to get involved in this field, and how long have you been doing that? Maybe that's not a fair question to you. You don't have to answer that one. And, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I started off as a scientist 5,000 years ago. I was doing graduate work on oil spills and using bacteria to clean up oil spills, and got really, really interested on what I would call generally green capitalism, using an environmental instrument or a capital or financial instrument to achieve an environmental outcome. And from there, really got involved in NOx and SOx trading and went to school, grad school in law in the States, where one of my profs was negotiating the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. And really the power of the market to achieve societal or environmental outcome, or both, really is at the heart of my personal beliefs and has extraordinary power. So that was 30 years ago, Nathan. And yeah, I say that quietly now. And it's migrated through various forms of policy and legislation and involvement with the United Nations and active negotiating the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the related elements of the Paris Agreement that flow from that. So it's been part passion, part obsession, and it's gone through good years and bad years, but really where we are now is, I hate to use the term, we've come a long way, baby, but we have come a long way, baby, from where we started 30 odd years ago in the development of the policy and the formalization of the instrument into, I'll say broadly, an asset class, which can be used for varying purposes.
Just so when I introduce myself, I usually say I have 30 plus years, and somebody told me, no, just say 20 plus. When 20 plus, lots of experience. When you say 30, you sound old, but I think they were referring to me, not to you. You wear it much better than I do.
I'll wear the I'll own it.
So in your opinion, what are some of the current trends? And also, what do you predict what future trends will be in this area?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that we're really seeing develop very significantly. Nature-based climate solutions, or NBS, as it's known, or NCS, as it's known, are really very active. And those are either preserving existing landscapes, forests, and preventing deforestation and forest destruction, or reforesting areas that were afforested or destroyed. And we're seeing a lot of initiatives around there because the narrative is pretty easy to tell. If you're an extractive industry, if you're speaking to a public, trees are inherently understandable. Some of the other elements of how you would create a carbon credit are trickier to understand. So those forms of emission reductions and emission removals, where you're planting in an area that's never been planted, are really, really attractive and growing in importance and price. And the second major trend that we see is in relation to negative emissions technology solution removals. You saw an article in the Globe yesterday about carbon engineering licensing its direct air capture technology. Think of it as a CO2 vacuum from the air. Really what it's based on is submarine technology. So vacuuming the CO2 from the air, mineralizing it and putting it back underground in a permanently stable mineral form. That's extremely attractive and part of the solution of where we need to go to actually achieve our Paris goals. So those are two major trends in the types of assets we see. And then in the markets themselves, we're seeing very creative sustainable finance initiatives arise. So sustainability-linked loans, sustainable asset-backed finance in many forms, and integration of public-private partnerships around what can be done and what should be done to build new infrastructure that is inherently sustainable. And when I say sustainable, I mean not just climate reducing, but also, climate emission reducing, but also adaptive. So addressing what we are currently feeling as the changes resulting from climate change.
Nathan, we have a poll here to help kind of connect with what Lisa's saying, to see if how anybody has already invested or used carbon credits in their business and daily life. Interesting. Who's already engaged on this?
So while that's going on, I'll ask you a couple of questions, Lisa. You can answer them in any order. So do you see this topic as legal, as financial, as societal, or some Venn diagram of that? And my other question is, what kind of misconceptions do you see? Like right now, there's a trend in mining where everyone's claiming their tailings is the vacuum for CO2. You know, I think they're ignoring all the trees that they have to cut down to do the mining. But, you know, that could be one misconception. Another one is like people are saying like, well, pay me not to chop down my tree. And I had no intention of chopping down said tree. But, you know, if you pay me, we're going to save, some CO2 because the tree is there. Oh, here's the results. It looks like 60% no, have they personally invested, about a quarter yes, and 20% are not sure if they've invested in their daily lives or not. That's an interesting one. Is that what you see, Lisa? Do people?
That's a really good answer in terms of not sure, because many people are not aware that they're currently investing or using carbon credits in your business or daily life. Do you get gas from Enbridge? You are investing in carbon credits if you have. Do you have an electricity supplier that is powering your home or your business? Quite often there's associated carbon assets included in that. So I think many more people are in fact investing in a carbon instrument, carbon asset, and they don't know it. You asked about misconceptions. There are many, but the first question, just remind me again, Nathan, was about.
If you see it as I know you're in the legal area, but is this more legal, financial, just altruistic, societal?
Yeah, no, and I've done a talk recently on the top 10 Oscar nominations, and the answer to that question is really, really best crystallized by the film Everything Everywhere All the Time. It is a financial instrument, or can be. It can be a commodity. It can be used for related financing. It can have huge societal and community benefits. And there are specific protocols for types of credits that are what we call charismatic carbon, that have that character to it. And it's much more than just what we used to call consumer CSR. It's definitely much more of a mainstay financial instrument or asset class that will help us transition to a decarbonized world. So it does have characteristics of finance. It does have characteristics of a societal instrument. Best way to think about it is everything, everywhere, all the time. On your question on misconceptions, I don't know if any of you have seen the John Oliver segment on carbon offsets. It was hilarious. It was very, very funny. It was replete with misconceptions. It's not just paying somebody to avoid polluting. It isn't a free-for-all with wild, wild west. Room for improvement, room for increased standardization, room for increased monitoring and reporting. There was a recent Guardian article that was pretty critical of some of the methodologies. There was a reply with scientific experts saying you've got a lot of this wrong. But some of the misconceptions we see are you're just paying somebody not to pollute when they weren't going to pollute anyway. Not true. There's a concept called additionality that you have to show. You have to show that this is not business as usual. This is regulatory additional, so additional to required regulatory requirements or legal requirements, and also financially additional. This is not just what would have happened with the regular investment of funds in the normal course of business. And this is why renewable energy in areas that are highly adaptive to renewable energy is becoming less additional and less subject of the ability to create a carbon credit. Also, people don't understand that there are two types of markets. There's the voluntary carbon market, where it's not required. You're simply undertaking activity in accordance with a protocol or a recipe to create a credit because you want to, and many are buying those credits. And then there's compliance carbon credits, where, for example, in Canada, we have a regulated offset system. In Alberta, they have the tier system. In many other jurisdictions around the world, California, they have their own systems of offsets that can be used as a compliance instrument in a regulated carbon pricing system, whether that's a cap and trade or a carbon pricing writ large system. They're very regulated and rigorous about what you can use. And quite often, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, we see a bit of a convergence. We see people starting with the voluntary market and certain countries allowing endorsement in a compliance situation.
Is one more impactful than the other, or it seemed like you're saying both are working?
Both are working because one without the other, you're missing part of the value chain. The voluntary market captures what is yet to be the subject of regulation. The compliance market often is associated with a regulated cap, whether that is the country's nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement or an actual number, a cap on emissions like Canada has. And that's very important, right? If we're going to meet the Paris agreements, we have to keep our eye on the ball. We have to reduce emissions such that we're at net zero by 2050. And the impacts of not doing that are pretty disastrous. You can only need to look to Bloomberg or any other news source to see the difference between a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise and a 2-degree rise, and 3 degrees is quite disastrous in terms of people and ecosystems and geopolitics and aquatic ecosystems. There's a host of impacts that are really important to keep in mind.
Can you describe for us some of the more impactful or innovative projects that either you or through Resilient or even that you've heard about, type of projects out there?
Yeah, let me talk about my first project, one of my first projects a gazillion years ago with the World Bank, where there was a sugar mill in India that was producing in the normal course and much effluent and sludge coming out of that production. And it was causing significant emissions and other issues associated with the degradation of that waste that were causing some health problems in the local communities. And technology provider came along and said, we can do this by actually capturing the waste, which is called bagasse, and using it to actually produce energy to electrify or energize the related plant. And, we're going to sell the emission credits to the World Bank to help us finance that activity. With the revenues, we will decrease the cost of capital to make the plant be built. We'll also build a hospital. We'll give a number of the revenue streams back to the local communities, and everybody wins. So that was very, very significant project. On the removal side, last year, we were involved, it's public, in the sale of emission removals from Occidental Petroleum and their subsidiary 1.5, using that direct air capture, that carbon vacuum, to Airbus to help make all of its flights effectively approach net zero. And very significant, first of its kind, global in impact, and the largest globally in the removal space. So those are two types of deals that we've seen that have been quite significant. And certainly the nature-based climate solutions deals are very impactful on local communities. We were having a little discussion in the pre-preparation stage of this about certain mining ESG activities that really are the gift that keeps on giving to local communities. Many of the nature-based climate solutions, I'd point you to the work of Worldwide Carbon, WWC, who works with Everland, a marketing company, to really facilitate those benefits. They really have great stuff going on that are additional. They work with the governments, so there's certainty, and it's actually beneficial to the projects in the area as well. Lots of good stuff.
Yeah,
there's a fair bit of questions here going on. There's a fair bit of, in the chat right now asking about monitoring this. So Lisa's speaking about, the implementation, where trends are going, and the Paris Agreement. But a fair bit of people are saying, how do we manage this and the policing of it? And it's so global, and Canada has, as you just mentioned, you have one province going, speaking about, the way they're managing it versus another province. But this is only Canada. How do we? There's a fair bit of questions about policing.
Yeah, let me speak to that. In Canada, it's a bit easier because it's a regulated system and there are regulatory requirements. But in each and all cases, whether it's a voluntary system or compliance system, there's the requirement to have an arm's length independent verifier actually confirm that what you say is going to be reduced was reduced in a very technical and structured manner. Not easy to pass those verification requirements. So in the first instance, the project itself is validated. Yes, if you implement this project, it will result in these emission reductions. And the second part is verification. This project did result in these emission reductions. We go on site, we test the equipment, we have data, we subject that to all sorts of rigorous data requirements in accordance with the defined standard. The largest one is called VERA, which administers the verified carbon standard. And if it's not verified, it's not worth the paper it's written on. We do have some instances in the market right now. If it's not verified, don't touch it. That's your integrity voice speaking. We also have a couple of oversight initiatives. The Carney Commission, the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon market, which is now called the Integrity Commission for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or ICVCM, is looking at the supply side and trying to administer a series of core carbon principles that, if it meets those core carbon principles, the supply will get a tag. And then on the demand side, I sit on the expert advisory group of the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, which is looking at what claims you can make with the best supply. And so this is ongoing. And then last but not least, there's a role for the public in oversight. Many of these are publicly posted or have to be as part of the creation initiative. And there are competitive forces who want to, give it a hard time, give it a go, if it's not the highest and best. And so we see that public consultation being used actively. So lots of mechanisms now for oversight. Of course, the best is regulation, but the standardization of the voluntary market has come a long, long way and is coming further as well. Oh, I see a question just pop up that I want to answer. Can I go at it?
Yeah, go for it.
You're allowed.
The question was the Kyoto mechanism effective? And the Kyoto mechanism was actually three mechanisms. There was the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, which was really effective at bringing awareness to carbon pricing and facilitating emission reductions in countries that didn't have a cap under the Kyoto Protocol. That's really how we got to carbon pricing in China. If they had not been active participants in the CDM, the concept of China implementing a market mechanism would have not happened. It just simply wouldn't have happened. Then there was the joint implementation mechanism, which was in developing countries. that had been economies in transition predominantly. And there are arguments as to why that was or was not effective. Certainly in terms of reaching that global scenario where everyone is covered by a cap, that didn't happen until Paris. And that's where we need to go. That's where we went. But Kyoto was a good start. Some of the protocols were very effective. Paris is where we need to go.
Well, we should send a mug to whoever asked that question. A nice share it mug. So Lisa, Lisa, there's some words that we hear in the public, like offsetting, insetting, leakage, additionality. What should the audience know? Like, what do these mean? What do they not mean?
Yeah, so we touched upon additionality, that it has to be additional to business as usual. You can't just do the same thing you've always done or the same thing that you're financially incented to do and get a carbon credit. It does have to be additional to business as usual, additional to regulatory requirements, and it has to have a real associated benefit. Leakage is part of how you determine whether or not there's that benefit. Are you simply moving production from one side of a border to another side of the border? Are the emissions just changing jurisdiction with the same atmospheric impact? So that's one of the criteria that you have to look at. What is the leakage dynamic when you are creating a credit? And if there is leakage, significant leakage, you cannot create that credit. Offsetting is often now seen to be determined to be compliance mitigation, contributing to compliance mitigation. It's when you use it, a specific emission reduction that's beyond your scope of activity. You're all probably familiar with scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Your direct, your indirect energy, and your supply chain emissions, 1, 2, 3. When you go beyond that and you purchase somebody else's emission reductions to use against your emission reductions, and sometimes that's part of a compliance system. So California and Quebec and Alberta absolutely allow regulated offsets to be used as compliance instruments in their systems. And they have recipes or protocols or methodologies for how you do that. And other times they're voluntarily created. Insetting is when you look into your supply chain and you actually help someone in your supply chain reduce those emissions, and you use them in your overall calculation of your often scope 3 emissions. So, for example, airlines right now are trying to incent their customers to fly using sustainable aviation fuel. And they do that by facilitating these programs where the customers actually purchase a higher price ticket that goes towards the purchasing of sustainable aviation fuel. So the airline takes a scope 1 emission reduction, the customer takes a scope 3 emission reduction. That's a form of insetting. And that's to enable the supply of sustainable aviation fuel to, in a market-based manner, increase. We're really low on the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that we need to actually get to a net zero criteria that's required by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which has its own form of regulated but quasi-voluntary emission reduction scheme. Right now, we're in the preliminary phase. We'll switch in 2025 to the mandatory phase.
Someone just messaged me privately with their home email or home address for the mug. I have no idea if they actually asked the question or not. I'll rely on Cheryl. So if I take a plane and promise to plant some mango trees in Cuba, does that count?
Not really, unless you go through a protocol and your mango plantation in Cuba meets all the requirements of one of the standards methodologies. And if the mango trees were being built, I'm going to say mangrove, on a coastal area that is facilitating complete absorption of the carbon that would otherwise be released when you destroy those marsh and mangrove areas. That's called blue carbon, and that's a very important form of removal. It's going to take you about 2 years to actually develop that project, go through all the requirements to produce your project design document, or PDD. I was telling the gang earlier, in carbon, we don't really speak English. We only speak TLAs or FLAs, 3-letter acronyms or 4-letter acronyms. So I'm going to try and define them, but if you catch me out, please call me out. So in that regard, it's going to take you about 2 years to get through creating your project design document, having your project validated, getting it registered with the voluntary carbon system and a verified carbon system, and having it verified by an arm's length, independent, qualified verifier before you have your carbon credit in hand. So Nathan, if you want to go and undertake that in relation to your next flight, have at it.
Shouldn't an FLA have 4 words in it? Cheryl, you said there was somebody from Cooper had a question.
Cooper Quinn's actually got some great questions. I think there's 2 things that we do have, and I'd like to make sure we get to our next question. Like, if there's a company, how do you start this? So let's get Cooper in, and then Nathan can ask the next question after. Cooper, if you don't mind, either just voice over or video if you want, and you can ask Lisa.
There's so much pressure. And yeah, I was with Nathan there. I was trying to wrap my head around the FLA being a TLA, and it was a bit confusing there. But no, thanks so much, Lisa. I just kind of curious how you see kind of the CDR and the offset markets evolving. Certainly you mentioned Vera earlier. Obviously, I think the people in the space kind of saw some of the pushback on the nature-based solutions. We're seeing a bit more of that, and maybe an increasing focus on durability, but then you've got the high cost of technology-based solutions and stuff. So how you kind of see the compliance markets shifting and adapting to account for some of that? And you're seeing a little bit of that in the voluntary markets, maybe with Puro's changes to kind of their durability requirements and stuff. But just curious, kind of like, it seems like we're seeing a bit of a shift here, and curious to see what you think, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, we don't see a rapid fall off in the market in any way, shape, or form. It's a great question, Cooper. In relation to the actual forward market curve, there are a number of agencies out there. I would say Clear Blue is one, Opus is another one, that actually publish forward market curves for price, of course. But in relation to the voluntary market, we see enhanced stringency around the criteria coming forward. We see convergence with, in particular, countries' compliance standards. So we saw this with Indonesia, where they had a few-month moratorium on any voluntary credits coming outside of their jurisdiction. They were very adamant in saying, nothing goes out until we figure out what we're doing with our newest discovered natural resource, and that natural resource is carbon. And you're seeing many countries kind of discover that we're going to treat this just like we do other extractive resources. We have to figure out what the concession scheme is, what the royalty scheme is, how this works for our country. So with that convergence, we see some really interesting increases in certainty in the market. We see some not so great examples of activity that's being weeded out of the market. On the compliance side, we track through the International Emissions Trading Association. Full disclosure, I am currently the active chair of that global organization. We track the number of countries that are implementing carbon pricing schemes, and that is increasing at an exponential rate, and we don't see that decreasing. So we don't see it as a straight line increase in the curve. There's going to be bumps along the way. But we do, with a number of these initiatives, see a general trend toward very significant increase in the marketplace. And if you look at the last 2 years, I think the rate of change is fairly predictive of what we're expecting over the next 10 years.
Better to start than try to expect perfection out of the gate. It's not going to happen, right? We're just going to run another poll, Nathan, and see how people are feeling about this now, since they've gotten a little bit more information from Lisa. Can carbon credits be used to mitigate climate change? So Lisa, you get a temperament of the room.
That's great. I have a spoiler on this one. So Yeah, but
Oh,
you
we're
know,
looking.
point that's really good in terms of don't expect perfection out of the gate. Perfection is the enemy of the good right now. This 7-year window, if you follow the science, if you are a student of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is 1,400 independent scientists from around the world that have received the Nobel Prize for their work in this area, we don't have time to waste. So I'd rather be 98% sure on the data and requirements and get that activity undertaken now before 2030, instead of having to take very painful action and costly action from 2030 to 2050.
So it seemed like the lion's share was agree or strongly agree, but there was, 38% disagree. So how do you mitigate that?
I think education's a huge part of that, for sure. And I'm going to point you to the University of Maryland peer-reviewed study that shows that with carbon credits, carbon pricing in the system, you can either do 250 billion more emission reductions per year or save $1 trillion in the cost of compliance compared to command and control. And that's what it's about. It's more, faster, and cheaper. That's the role of the carbon credit. And really now is the time, as I say, this 7-year period is really, really important. And critical minerals are a critical part of that trajectory. So I'm looking forward to seeing what mining operations around the world will do to utilize carbon as an asset class.
Bobby was asking if there's a link for the study, if you can get it to us after, or if you have it, we can add it to the chat or make sure people have an opportunity to see it. Two more questions from me. You can answer them any way you'd like. So what's your personal opinion about the importance of collaboration and partnerships in carbon credit space? And the second one, if people want to get involved in the carbon finance field and want to make a positive impact, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. First of all, on collaboration, you've hit the nail on the head. The best, what we call most charismatic carbon credits have government involvement in the form of agreement or benefit sharing. They have local community and stakeholder involvement, and they have an ongoing benefit to the area and the community. And that transparency that happens through a broader community as well is a key part of the narrative. So the short answer is collaboration is critical. The more you do, the more charismatic your carbon will be. The more charismatic your carbon is, the higher price you get for it. It's really that simple.
Is that a thing, CCC, the charismatic carbon credit? Can we use it now?
Well, some of the brokers definitely use it. So charismatic carbon. And you'll see that this has moved from a developer model where you have these small businesses who are active in developing credits. And if you want to get involved, they're great to talk with, to a number of those developers growing to the size where they're being acquired by banks and other institutional providers. So you can see in the news the recent acquisition of Radical by Bank of Montreal. So BMO Radical is a very significant developer. Similarly, Blue Source was acquired by a private equity group, TPG. They're now called Anu, very significant developer. These are the folks that you want to go to and you say, listen, I've got to undertake some infrastructure change, or I'm developing a mine. I want to do it in a sustainable way. How can I do that to actually harness the carbon-related value in the area to help me do and undertake this project in the most sustainable way? And if I do so, am I eligible for favorable finance in the form of sustainability like loans or a bond or some other form of sustainable finance that is available to me as a function of that better than a norm, that additional emission reduction benefit that I've created from developing in this way?
I see Jan has his hand up, very polite.
Yeah, there's an interesting question on the Q&A. Amazon has come out with a new carbon credit label they call Abacus. I presume that you get your carbon credit delivered to your doorstep. But what is your view of the involvement of companies like Amazon in this space?
Yeah, Amazon and Bezos Earth Fund are taking a leadership role in the space, very significant leadership role. And one of the most talented people in the carbon market, who is now working for Bezos Earth Fund, is Kelly Kazire. She was one of the lead negotiators on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And when we talk about integrity and quality and the best credits possible, I would hold up a picture of Kelly next to that. So I'm quite thrilled that Bezos is in and very actively developing differentiated carbon offerings. They've got something involved. They've got involvement in the recent John Kerry announced Energy Transition Accelerator. Rockefeller is also involved in that. They've got involvement in ocean-related carbon. They've got significant involvement in all forms of nature-based climate solutions and driving integrity there. And they've been very involved in the SABA, Sustainable Aviation Buyers Association, carbon credit requirements and developing demand there. So I'm generally a fan of what's gone on through Bezos Earth.
So Lisa, I was asking you about, how do people get involved? But Cheryl just asked me, what would corporations do if they want to get started along the path of carbon credits? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, I would suggest contacting one of the developers or looking at your operations in relation to a number of the available methodologies. And you're, I'm going to get the acronym wrong now, ICCMM, is that right? Has a number of activities on it. Rio Tinto has been a leader in that. And so looking at what your global industry association has and what information they have on accessing the carbon markets voluntarily. Also, when you're working on concessions or dealing with related royalties and land rights, mining rights with certain governments, this should be a term. This should definitely be a head of term that you are actively negotiating and considering with those governments. There's a lot of value there, both for them and for you. So don't just let it dissipate without even considering it. In terms of individuals, there are a number of things you can look at, either predominantly through your utility or through other organizations that are accessible to individuals. Somebody mentioned Puro Earth. They're predominantly removals. It was Cooper mentioned Puro Earth, predominantly removals focused. And we, as a law firm, are looking at offsetting a number of our emissions, which are predominantly scope 3, through a removals offering, and they're accessible to people. Virgin also has a people accessible offering. There are a number that have portfolios of carbon credits if you want to look at your own emissions profile. And Microsoft has a GHG emissions calculator. So if you want to start with the knowledge of just how bad am I from an emitter perspective, as a law firm, we were pretty good on our direct scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. It's terrible on scope 3 emissions relatively because of how often I spend it, how much time I spend on a plane. So looking at that and building that into your decarbonization strategy is a big deal. And there were certain things that we did that were really straightforward. We moved to a paperless firm. Paper consumption was one of the biggest forms of emissions. We're all on iPads where all our notes are taken on iPads now. And it was kind of a win-win solution. It made for much easier filing requirements and recording of data for us and really decreased our related paper costs. ICMM, that's what I see.
Can
Thanks.
I ask the dreaded question? You see on the people flying around the gates, the private jets, and I think this kind of feeds into the pieces where people say, is this really going to make a change? Are we just going to shift a bit of greenwashing. Let's just call it what it is, right? So we have, Gates saying I'm saving here, but I'm flying everywhere to save there. So I find it's conflicting and how to absorb this. And then we have, at the beginning, kind of going back to this piece where we said we don't even know if we're helping carbon credits. So is there really just a lack of media attention on this, advertising, like something? I'm in Ontario, the OPG, like why do I had no idea this was happening. So I'm kind of looking at the beginning of this question of our conversation here. Why don't I know? And why don't I really understand the intricacies, this, I guess, more scope 3 items that happens with people trying to make change, but they're taking jets to go make that change. So.
Well, Cheryl, shouldn't we have checked with our speaker if she has a private jet?
Yeah. No private jet and 2 electric cars. So but you know what? Not easy. I'm still heated by natural gas. We're in the process of converting our house to ground source heat pump. It's a process, and you have to do your homework, and those examples are not readily available. I'll give you a little war story. December 16th, I got back from 2 weeks of an arbitration on the fundamental property nature of carbon credits in Washington, D.C. And our hot water heater died. And Cheryl, to your point, why don't I know? I'm in the energy and the carbon business. We moved 3 years ago. I didn't realize that we rented our hot water tank. So the reality is you're busy. You're managing a bunch of stuff and you just pay your bill. You don't look at it very carefully. And that's a problem, right? Awareness and transparency is a problem. And the big lesson here was I actually had to fight with both the utility and the alternate HVAC provider to get a tankless, low emission hot water solution. They're like, no, you don't want that. It's going to take you 10 weeks. No, I really, 10 days. I said, no, I really do want it. Well, no, just put it in a hot water tank. I said, no, you don't understand. I want it. It's going to cost you 10 times the amount. I want it, and I literally had to fight. We waited 10 days with intermittent hot water, barely any, to get that tankless hot water tank in. And that's in Toronto where it's accessible and available. In terms of why don't you know, part of the reason is disclosure. And this year, when you asked me about trends, I should have talked about this, Nathan. This year, there's been a huge burgeoning of related disclosure requirements pertaining to climate change, how you're mitigating it, and what you're using to mitigate it. And that started historically with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. You ready for another FLA? This is a TCFD, and it's based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol published by WRI and WWF together. And then there have been a number of regulated disclosure requirements. You saw the Canadian Securities Administrators come out with 51107, mandating what climate-related disclosure looks like in draft form. Immediately after, you saw the US SEC come out with their 432-page disclosure document, which is not yet finalized. And then you saw the CSA saying, we're going to coordinate, we're going to harmonize, so we create consistency in the market. And then you saw the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, get co-located in Montreal and in Frankfurt, pushing for harmonized global standards based on IFRS and SASB. And so they've come out with a couple of discussion documents as well. So part of the reason why you don't know is that there haven't been enough disclosures. And secondly, the increasingly mandatory nature of those disclosures also provides an opportunity for those who are doing the best, have the best decarbonization strategies, and are telling people precisely what they're doing. And greenwashing claims are also the new flavor of the month. I'm going to say flavor of the year for environmental NGOs who are calling out companies who are not doing what they're saying they're doing and who are overreaching on claims. And those take really two forms. One is the form of a consumer protection type complaint or Advertising Standards Council type complaint, and the other takes the form of a regulated securities type complaint. And we've seen many, many, many actions that are greenwashing complaints this year. We've done a paper with the Global Risk Institute. Janice Sarah is the lead author. I'm the second author on that paper, looking at all of those complaints and how they apply to your fiduciary duties, how they apply to management requirements, and how they may be characterized at law. I'd recommend you download that paper, and we'll send that to you as well, Cheryl. Just you'll remind me what I've promised to send.
Yeah, no problem.
This one, yeah.
That is great, because I'm looking at some of the audience members, and we're all in a network and talk to each other, and several of them had mentioned, Lisa, you were coming on, and Nathan and Jan and I were talking about it and saying, having this information is great, but absolutely right back to your water tank situation. If you want to go more green, if you want to, make your facilities more, in line with, reducing your carbon footprint, where do you start? Who do you call? And we have all our traditional lines that we call, and we just get the same old machines, the same old, so we do find it's a challenge to get out of that routine of just calling another rented, tank or whatever it is. But it's also finding the people who have gone through this process and understand what to do.
Yeah, at a corporate level, in terms of the consulting side, there's the class of developers. So that would be Anu and BMO Radical would be the two big ones in the Canadian marketplace. There are many others for forestry. On the consultancy side, there was something recently published. We see Deloitte quite often. We see BCG and McKinsey are playing a more active role, but all of the big four have some semblance of decarbonization strategy. So you can often get that from your auditor.
There were a couple of comments from Emma and Jim about greenwashing, so we'll take a look at later. Lisa, by the way, I was going to give a bottle of Cuban rum to anyone who could stump you, but I think I'm safe. No one's going to be able to do that in the last few minutes here. I had a question about targets or dates. Like almost every company has a 2030 target and a 2050 target, and then they'll say, for 2050 we have no idea, the technology is not invented yet, but hopefully it will be. So they can get 2/3 of the way before that, knowing what they know, and then 2050 maybe is more aspirational. Do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, the best companies actually have a line of sight on 2050, and then they have interim targets for 2030 with a clear knowledge of how you're getting there for 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, and then 2050. Large companies, for example, are iterative on those plans. And I think that's key. This is back to your point, Cheryl, and not letting perfection be the enemy of the good. You want to update those plans. 5 years ago, carbon removals through negative emissions technologies and direct air capture were not an active part of the commercial world. 2025, we will have completion, commercial operation date on one of the world's first plant. So you want to continually renew that. And that's important for your stakeholders and your disclosures as well. Scientific method, as you all know, probably coming from science backgrounds, is based on a hypothesis and trying to negate a hypothesis. And as the science changes, you want to update your related plans. You want to make sure they're accurate, line of sight, targets are there, the related activities in the suite of your sector, your industry are there, and often a pressure relief valve in the form of removals, offsets, or insets. And really, insets have many, many benefits. They make your existing supply chain stickier. And in a world where supply chains are challenged by inflation, by trade protectionism, by geopolitics, making your supply chain stickier is very helpful. So there's a lot to think about. And what we've seen regularly, Nathan, is that people go out with a vision target from that strategy. And once it gets implemented, there's overcompliance. Once people understand the power of the market, there's in fact over-compliance. So that's pretty interesting. For me, that shows just how powerful the instrument is.
There's another poll there. I like this one.
I guess it depends on your food choice, but if your carbon credits were a type of food, what would they be? So let's see, Lisa, how much you've swayed the group. We do have, we saw earlier a bit of septic, some people not necessarily believing in it right now or just understanding, but I think you've convinced me on the idea that there has to be a fair bit of transparency. And I didn't really actually understand just how much regulation was going into this and the oversight going on. There's still questions like, how do you ensure this? How do you make sure everybody's following along? There's still tons of questions in the chat here, but you've definitely convinced me more here.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
No, go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead.
I should mention that all of the regulated systems, particularly in Canada, have an audit function. And the government does periodically and randomly audit the offsets that are created if they're in a compliance system. Similarly, some of the voluntary standards have the ability to audit and do. I would point to, in particular, the gold standard, which is really quite good in that regard.
I'm going to give you one more question, and then you can leave us with anything you'd like. So if I was able to give you the magic wand, what would you like to change in this area?
Oh, tough question. Tough question. I think if you were to give me the magic wand, I would have a global compliance system that played by the exact same rules for what a carbon credit is, how it's created, how it can be used, and really facilitated transboundary transactions to hit those targets faster. Right now, we have a fairly fragmented system with many rules, small differences, and we need some standardization to reach that. I'd take out the fraudsters as well. There are definitely some fraudsters in the market that you have to be careful for. And we come across them. We see contracts come across our desk where we just kind of, as I said, not worth the paper it's written on. There's no verification. That standard doesn't exist. Not worth the paper it's written on. So, yeah, I would be an overseer that waved the magic wand and really had transparent, clear, and certain standards that were applied uniformly in a very big way. We don't have enough of it going on right now.
I almost stumped you. I almost won my own bottle of rum.
No.
There was one good question that came in. If it's a short one, it was from Ernie about would small companies react the same way as big companies for stage 3 emissions? Or what can small companies do?
Small companies would really benefit from standardized approaches to measuring, monitoring, and reporting on their scope 3 emissions. And if you look at the Canadian Securities Administrators approach, there was a staggering between big and small in terms of what was required. And the more we can make the job easier, I'm a small company, so I certainly relate to the administrative burden. The more we can make that job easier by saying, here's your template, here's what you do, here's an example of how it's done, go do it. That would be fantastic. Or do it by a class. Small companies from this, here's your default data, unless you tell us you're much better than the default or worse than the default.
So before I thank a few people, Lisa, is there any words you want to leave us with? Anything I didn't ask about that you'd like to tell the audience?
Yeah, I think that in particular, the asset class has power, and in particular has power for the extractive sector. So you can go at it reactively or proactively. And I can almost guarantee that if you are proactive about your awareness, realization, and potential monetization of carbon as an asset class in your operations, you will do much better than your competitors and cohorts who go at it reactively. So lots to find out. And I do agree with salad.
Well, we're in the lunch zone in the Ontario and Alberta, so maybe that skewed this a little bit. But Lisa, first of all, thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy, and we really do appreciate it. You're certainly a wealth of knowledge in this area. I think all of us picked up some tidbits, so thank you for that. I'd like to thank the co-host Cheryl and Jan for putting this together. Our platform is the Smarten Up Institute, so we have Lori, we have Serge, and we have Jim online. But most importantly, thank you to the audience, always engaging, always asking lots of questions, always chatting among themselves. And we'll make sure you get a transcript, Lisa, because it's hard to see all the chats going on while you're talking. But you'll see some good questions came in there. So thank you, Lisa. Thanks, everyone. We do appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Fantastic. And if I can answer anything that hasn't been unanswered after this, I will go online and do so you can send them out with those links.
Great. Thanks so much.
For everyone's online, we have a Bits and Bytes website that has all this information. There will be a transcript that's put out in a video as well. We've recorded today, so you can access that anytime. It's with your registration and it's free. And we're here to bring new perspectives and ideas that are floating around. And as you can see, Lisa has a wealth of knowledge, and we will be able to send that information to her, and you can also connect with us if you need any further information. Thank you.